In the scriptural justice system, the highest authority, the Most High Yah, is the judge and the jury. The seed of Israel are his children. These are their stories. Season 1, Episode 5, The Arab Slave Trade. Fade in. A new map dominates the wall. Red lines trace routes from East Africa across the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean north through the Sahara. Dates marked 650 AD, 1900 AD. Banks stands before it, grim-faced, the team assembled. Banks, before Europeans ever touched Africa's western coast, another slave trade had been running for 800 years. Longer, bigger, more brutal. She points to the routes. The Arab-Islamic slave trade started around 650 AD, right after Islam's founding, didn't end until the early 1900s, 13 centuries. Chen, how many people? Estimates range from 10 to 18 million Africans, but those numbers don't tell the whole story. She clicks the remote. A document appears. Medieval Arabic text. Because there's something about this trade that's been buried, something so horrific most historians won't even talk about it. Riley, what? Systematic castration of boys and men before they ever reached their destination. Silence in the room. The following contains historically documented accounts of extreme violence and mutilation. This content may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Okafor stands before the display, visibly shaken. Okafor, I've been studying African history for 20 years. And this is the part they don't teach, the part that's been erased from curriculum. She pulls up medieval Islamic texts translated. The Arab slave trade didn't just take people. It systematically destroyed them, particularly the men. Why castration? Okafor, control. Elimination. They didn't want African slaves reproducing, didn't want their bloodlines continuing in Arab lands. She clicks through historical documents. Ibn Battuta, 14th century Arab traveller, documented it. He wrote about the eunuch makers, specialists who performed castrations on enslaved African boys and men before they reached markets. How was it done? Okafor. Multiple methods, all brutal. The most common, complete removal of genitalia, penis and testicles. They'd pack the wound with boiling oil or hot sand to cauterize it. She shows a medieval illustration, clinical but horrifying. Mortality rate was 60 to 90%. Most died from blood loss, infection or shock. The ones who survived were sold as eunuchs for higher prices. 60 to 90% died? Yes. Which means for every castrated slave that reached market, 6 to 9 others died in the process. Banks, and nobody talks about it. Not in schools, not in mainstream histories. Why? Okafor. Because it implicates Islamic empires in genocide. Because it reveals that the Arab slave trade was worse in some ways than the transatlantic trade. Because it's politically inconvenient. How does this connect to the Hebrews? Okafor. The Arab slave trade operated primarily in East Africa and across the Sahara. Remember the Hebrew communities we documented? Beta Israel in Ethiopia, Lemba ancestors in East Africa. They were in the direct path. She pulls up a map showing Hebrew community locations overlaid with Arab slave trade routes. They were captured, enslaved, and subjected to the same treatment. Banks presents to the team with Dr. Abdullah Mansour, 60s Egyptian historian, clearly uncomfortable sitting at the table. Dr. Mansour, you've written extensively on medieval Islamic history. Yes. You've published 12 books on Islamic Golden Age civilizations. Correct. How many mention the slave trade? Pause. That's not the focus of my work. None. The answer is none. Why? Islamic history is complex. I'm asking about slavery. Specifically, the enslavement of Africans by Arab traders from the 7th century onward. Did it happen? Yes. Banks, were enslaved men and boys castrated systematically? Long silence. Yes. What percentage of male slaves were castrated? It varied by region and time period. Estimate. In some regions, perhaps 20 to 40% of male slaves. 20 to 40%? And mortality rate from the procedure. Mansour high. Very high. Banks numbers, doctor. 60% minimum. Some sources say higher. So if Arab traders captured 100 African men and castrated 40 of them, approximately 24 to 36 would die from the procedure alone. Yes, and you wrote 12 books about Islamic civilization without mentioning this. It's a difficult subject. It's genocide, and you buried it. Riley works with historical records, his face pale. Riley, the numbers are staggering. Listen to this. He reads from a medieval source. Al-Makrizi, 15th century Egyptian historian. The Zanj, that's what they called black Africans, are taken from their lands and brought to the markets. The males are made eunuchs, so they may serve without rebellion or reproduction. He pulls up another document, Ibn Khaldun, 14th century. The making of eunuchs is a profitable trade. Though many die, those who survive command high prices in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. They were commodities. Worse, they were deliberately destroyed, made incapable of having families, of continuing their bloodlines. He shows a chart, estimated numbers. Total enslaved, 10 to 18 million. Males castrated, 2 to 7 million. Mortality from castration, 1.2 to 6.3 million. Survivors sterile, unable to reproduce. Riley. That's why there are almost no descendants of African slaves in Arab lands. They weren't allowed to have children. Chen. That's systematic elimination. Riley, it's worse than elimination. It's erasure. They took people, destroyed their ability to continue, worked them to death, and left no trace. SALT, Research Lab Day. Okafor pulls up records of Hebrew communities in Arab lands. Now let's talk about what happened to Hebrews specifically. She shows documentation of Beta Israel, Ethiopian Hebrews, being captured and sold into Arab slave markets. Ethiopian records from the 9th through 15th centuries document raids by Arab traders. They specifically targeted the Beta Israel communities because they were distinct, identifiable, and considered infidels. Banks. They were Hebrew, not Muslim. Okafor exactly, which made them targets. Islamic law technically forbade enslaving Muslims, but had no such protection for infidels, Jews, Christians, pagans. She pulls up more documents. Hebrew communities along the East African coast, modern-day Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, were raided repeatedly. The Lemba oral traditions speak of the time of cutting, their euphemism for when Arab slavers came. Riley, the time of cutting, they mean castration? Oh, yes, they remember it. It's in their oral history. Young men taken, mutilated, sold away. The community never saw them again. Banks, because they died. Or if they survived, they couldn't have children to pass down the story. Precisely, an entire generation of Hebrew men eliminated from the gene pool. Conference room day. Banks pulls up a new map, trade routes to Asia. Banks. Now we talk about something even less known, the Indian Ocean slave trade, and specifically the route to China. Riley, Hebrews went to China? Yes. There are documented Hebrew communities in Kaifeng, China, dating back to the Song dynasty around 1000 AD. Chen, I'm Chinese American. I've never heard of this. Most people haven't, because by the 1800s, the community had nearly vanished. But they were there, and here's how they arrived. She clicks through historical Chinese records, translated. Song dynasty records mention foreigners from the West who arrived by sea. They spoke a different language, practiced strange customs, refused certain foods. Okafor, Hebrew practices. The Chinese called them Tiao Jin Jiao, literally the plucking sinew religion, because they removed the sciatic nerve from meat before eating it. Riley, that's Genesis 32:32. After Jacob wrestled with the angel, Hebrews don't eat the sciatic nerve. That's an obscure Hebrew practice, exactly. These weren't just any foreigners. They were Hebrews. And according to their own records, they came as merchants and refugees. But others came as slaves. She pulls up a darker set of documents. Chinese records from Tang and Song dynasties mention Kunlun slaves, black Africans brought via Indian Ocean trade routes. Arab and Persian traders sold them in Chinese ports. Chen, were they castrated? Banks, yes. Before they were allowed off the ships, she shows a translated Chinese text from 850 AD. The foreign slaves are made eunuchs before entering the empire. This is done aboard ship to prevent them from corrupting Chinese bloodlines. Only those who survive the procedure are permitted entry. Silence. Riley. They castrated them on the boats? Banks, yes, while still at sea. The mortality rate was catastrophic. Some sources suggest 70 to 80% before ever touching land. Chen, why haven't I heard about this? I studied Asian history. Because China doesn't teach it. Because it reveals that China participated in the slave trade and in systematic mutilation of African people, because it's inconvenient. Okafor. And some of those African slaves were Hebrew. Yes. Hebrew communities in East Africa, captured by Arab traders, sold to Persian and Chinese merchants, castrated and shipped to China. She pulls up genetic studies. There's virtually no genetic trace of them, because they couldn't reproduce. The bloodline ended. Banks sits across from Professor Lei Jiang, 50s Chinese historian defensive. Professor Jiang, you teach Chinese medieval history at Columbia. Jiang, yes. Are you familiar with the Kunlun slave trade? Poets. Mentioned in some texts. Mentioned, not taught. It's not a major focus. Banks' Tang and Song dynasty records explicitly describe African slaves being brought to China via Indian Ocean routes. They describe systematic castration of male slaves before entry. You teach Tang and Song dynasties. Why don't you teach this? It's a sensitive subject. For whom? The slaves who were mutilated are dead. Their descendants don't exist because they were made incapable of having descendants. Who exactly is sensitive about this? The Chinese government, Banks. Doesn't want the world knowing they participated in slavery and systematic castration of African men. Yes. Were Hebrew people among those enslaved? I don't know. Hebrew communities existed in East Africa. Arab traders operated in those regions. Arab traders sold to Chinese merchants. So yes or no, were Hebrew people among the slaves brought to China? It's possible. Possible or documented. She slides a translated text across the table. Banks, Song Dynasty record, 1050 AD. Among the foreign slaves, some refuse pork and observe their peculiar Sabbath. They are troublesome and require harsh discipline. I've never seen this document, because it's been buried. But it exists. They documented it. Hebrew slaves in China, castrated, worked to death, erased. Int SALD, bullpen night. The team sits in heavy silence. The evidence laid out before them. Chen. This is... I don't even have words, Riley. Millions of people, mutilated, killed, erased from history, and nobody talks about it. Okafor, because three major power blocks, Arab nations, China and Europe, all participated in the slave trade in different ways, and none of them want to acknowledge the full scope. Banks, the Arab trade lasted 13 centuries, castrated millions of men, eliminated entire bloodlines. The Indian Ocean trade sent slaves to China, India, Persia, castrated them before arrival. And then the transatlantic trade took another 12 to 15 million. She stands, writes on the board, Deuteronomy 28:64, "The Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other." Banks east to China, north to Arab lands, across the Sahara, across the Indian Ocean, across the Atlantic, scattered to every corner of the earth. Riley, and in every direction they were enslaved. Okafor not just enslaved, systematically destroyed, prevented from reproducing, their bloodlines cut off. Chen, but some survived. Banks, some survived. The women were forced to bear children with their captors. Some men escaped castration. Some communities held on. And eventually, the largest wave comes. She circles a date on the timeline, 1502 AD. The transatlantic slave trade. The final fulfillment of Deuteronomy 28:68. In TSALTD, roof, night. Banks stands alone, staring at the city lights. Okafor joins her. Okafor, you okay? No, me neither. They stand in silence. My grandmother used to say her people suffered like no other people. I thought she was being dramatic. Old black church talk. She wasn't being dramatic. No, she was remembering. Maybe not consciously, but the trauma gets passed down. The knowledge that something was taken, something irreplaceable. Okafor, their identity. Banks, their manhood, literally. Arab traders castrated millions. Chinese traders castrated before the ships even docked, and in the Americas, she trails off. Different kind of castration. Psychological, spiritual, cultural. Banks, all of it designed to erase them, to make sure they never remembered who they were. She turns to Okafor. But we remember now. We're documenting it. Every horror, every crime, every attempt at erasure. Okafor for who? Banks for the descendants, for the ones who survived. So they know it wasn't their fault, it wasn't weakness, it was systematic, calculated genocide. Okan, they're still here. They're still here. The team assembles for final documentation. Banks. Let's put it all together. The Arab-Islamic slave trade, 650 to 1900 AD. She writes on the board, Arab slave trade facts. Duration 13 centuries. Total enslaved 10 to 18 million Africans. Males castrated 2 to 7 million, estimated. Mortality from castration 60 to 90%. Survivors sterile, no descendants. Routes Trans-Saharan, Red Sea, Indian Ocean. Hebrew communities directly targeted Beta Israel, East African groups. Banks, Indian Ocean, Chinese route, Indian Ocean trade, duration 800 to 1800 AD, slaves sent to China, India, Persian Gulf. Castration performed on ships before arrival, mortality 70 to 80% estimated. Hebrew presence documented in Chinese records. Modern descendants, virtually none. Bloodlines eliminated, Riley. That's genocide, by definition. Okafor, Article 2 of the UN Genocide Convention, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. That's literally what castration does. So Hebrew people were subjected to genocide, multiple times, across multiple continents, for over 1,000 years. Banks, yes, and most of the world has no idea because it's been buried by Arab scholars, Chinese historians, and Western academics who don't want to complicate their narratives. Riley, what do we do with this? Banks, we document it, we put it in the record, we make it undeniable. She turns to the timeline. Next episode, the transatlantic slave trade, the final scattering, the fulfillment of verse 68, ships to bondage. Okafor, and this time we have names, we have documents, we can trace specific people. Then let's trace them. Fade out. The Arab-Islamic slave trade operated for approximately 13 centuries, 650 to 1900 AD, and enslaved an estimated 10 to 18 million Africans. Systematic castration of male slaves was documented practice, with mortality rates of 60 to 90%. This practice was also documented in the Indian Ocean slave trade to China, Persia, and India. Hebrew communities in East Africa and Ethiopia were documented targets of these slave raids. Most modern history curricula do not teach this. Deuteronomy 28:41, Thou shalt beget sons and daughters, but thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity. End of episode 5.